Hello, this is Liberty Talk, and I'm Eli Shepherd, and I'm wearing my We the People shirt today because we the people are the true rulers of this country. The government is our servant. We are not theirs. No people were ever free until the establishment of this country. And for the first time in human history, the common man and woman was set free for the first time they had ever been free to see if we could truly govern ourselves. That's why this country is called the Great Experiment. And I think the American people have done an amazing job of governing ourselves. Although I do believe we have some dangerous and subversive groups within our government. Now, it's not the entire government that's bad. When I talk about these things, a lot of people get it confused and think it's the entire government. It's not the entire government. It's subversive groups and organizations within our government, as well as many different secret societies that are attempting to bring about a one-world government. So today, I'm going to do a very important video, probably one of the most important videos I've ever done, on the links between the CIA and drug running operations. You want to know who destroyed black and Hispanic communities? You want to know why your children are strung out on drugs and all these other horrible things? You want to know why gang violence happened so heavily in the 80s and the 90s? Well, you can blame the CIA for that. And I'm going to back up that statement with proof. And everything that I tell you on this broadcast or any other broadcast that I ever make is all in the public domain, and anybody can verify the research. This is Liberty Talk, and I am Elijah Shepherd, the voice of liberty. The United States Central Intelligence Agency has been accused of involvement in drug trafficking. Books and investigations on the subject have received general notice, including works by the historian Alfred McCoy, Professor and diplomat Peter Dale Scott, journalist Gary Webb, whose work we will be focusing on in this broadcast, and Alexander Cockburn, and writer Larry Collins. Now, these claims have led to investigations by the United States government, including hearings and reports by the United States House of Representatives, the Senate, Department of Justice, and the CIA's Inspector General. Gary Webb was an American investigative journalist. He began his career working for newspapers in Kentucky and Idaho, winning numerous awards and building a strong reputation for investigative writing. Webb is best known for his Dark Alliance series, which appeared in the Mercury News in 1996. The series examined the origins of the crack cocaine trade in Los Angeles and claimed that members of the anti-communist Contra rebels in Nicaragua had played a major role in creating the trade, using cocaine profits to finance their fight against the government in Nicaragua. It also stated that the Contras may have acted with knowledge and protection of the Central Intelligence Agency, also known as the CIA. The series provoked outrage, particularly in the Los Angeles African American community, and led to 4 major investigations of its charges. The Los Angeles Times and other major papers published articles suggesting that the Dark Alliance claims were overstated, and in November 1996, Jerome Cephas, I believe is how you say his last name, the executive editor at the Mercury News, wrote about being, quote, in the eye of the storm, unquote. In May 1997, after an internal review, Cephas stated that although the story was right on many important points, there were shortcomings in the writing, editing, and production of the series. He wrote that the series likely oversimplified the crack epidemic in America and the supposed critical role the dealers written about in the series played in it. Webb disagreed with this conclusion, Webb resigned from the Mercury News in December 1997. He became an investigator for the California State Legislature. Published a book based on the Dark Alliance series in 1998 and did freelance investigative reporting. He died by what was called a suicide on December the 10th, 2004. Now, I don't personally believe that he committed suicide, and I will read to you the suicide report, and you can ask yourself if you believe this man committed suicide. Webb was found dead in his home on December the 10th, 2004, with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. His death was ruled a suicide by Sacramento County Coroner's Office. According to a description of Webb's injuries in the Los Angeles Times, he shot himself with a .38 revolver, which he placed near his right ear. The first shot went through his face and exited his left cheek. The coroner's staff concluded that the second shot hit an artery. Folks, I have a .38 snub-nose revolver, and I can tell you right now, if someone attempts suicide and shoots themselves in the head, they are not going to be conscious enough to shoot themselves a second time in the head. That is what is called being suicided. I believe that Gary Webb was murdered, although I can't prove that. I do believe that an investigation should be reopened into his death. After a local newspaper reported that Webb had died from multiple gunshots, the coroner's office received so many calls asking about Webb's death that Sacramento County Coroner Robert Lyons issued a statement confirming Webb had died by, quote, suicide, unquote. When asked by local reporters about the possibility of 2 gunshots being a suicide, Lyons replied, quote, "It's unusual in a suicide case to have 2 shots. But it has been done in the past and is in fact a distinct impossibility," unquote. News coverage noted that there were widespread rumors on the internet at the time that Webb had been killed as retribution for his Dark Alliance series, which was published 8 years before. And I would have to agree with that assumption that he was indeed killed, probably by people that work in the Central Intelligence Agency who wanted to cover their ass. Because Webb knew too much and they were afraid of what else he might find out. Plus, he had inconvenienced them and already put them through the severe scrutiny of the American public. And they didn't want him to be able to do that again. That's just my personal thoughts on the matter, though. Now we have to start talking about Rick Ross, or as some people know him, Freeway Ricky Ross, who was used basically as a pawn by the CIA to run crack cocaine. Much of Ross's success at evading the law was due to his ring's possession of police scanners and voice scramblers. Furthermore, journalist Gary Webb alleged that the CIA was sponsoring the operation as part of its effort to finance the Contras, giving Ross another level of protection. Ross began selling cocaine after his illiteracy prevented him from earning a tennis scholarship for college. He began spending time with an upholstery teacher at a Los Angeles community college who revealed he dealt cocaine and offered Ross a small amount to sell. Ross used this profit to purchase more cocaine to sell, expanding his small operation. Ross eventually began to ask for quantities to sell that exceeded what the teacher was willing to procure, so he turned to find a new dealer. The teacher referred Ross to his supplier, Ivan Argelis, who offered to keep Ross who offered to keep Ross supplied. Argelis was able to provide large quantities at a better price, and Ross quickly went from dealing in grams of cocaine to dealing in ounces of cocaine. About 8 months after becoming Ross's supplier, Argelis was shot in the spine, resulting in months of hospitalization that forced him out of the cocaine business. His brother-in-law, Henry Quarles, took over the business, but was not enthusiastic about the trade and had failed to make many of the connections of his own suppliers. Blandone was acquainted with Argelis and Quarles, and although he did not know him personally, was impressed with the amount of cocaine that Ross was moving. Blandone offered to supply cocaine to Quarles to sell to Ross for a 50-50 split of the profit. Eventually, Quarles lost his appetite for the cocaine business and retired, at which point Ross became a direct customer of Blandone. Through his connections to Blandone and Blandone's supplier, Norwin Meneses Contrero, Ross was able to purchase Nicaraguan cocaine at significantly reduced rates. Ross began distributing cocaine at $10,000 per kilo, less than the average street price, distributing it in the Bloods and Crips street gangs. By 1982, Ross had received his moniker of Freeway Ricky, and claimed to have sold up to $3 million worth of cocaine per day, purchasing 1,000 pounds of cocaine a week. Ross initially invested most of his profits in houses and businesses because he feared his mother would catch on to what he was doing if he started spending lavishly on himself. In a jailhouse interview with reporter Gary Webb, Ross said, quote, "We were hiding our money from our mothers," unquote. He invested a portion of the proceedings from his drug dealing activities into Auntie Baker's first album. With thousands of employees, Ross had said he operated drug sales not only in Los Angeles, but in places across the country, including St. Louis, New Orleans, Texas, Kansas City, Oklahoma, Indiana, Cincinnati, North Carolina, South Carolina, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Seattle. He has said that his most lucrative sales came from Ohio area. He made similar claims in a 1996 PBS interview. Federal prosecutors estimated that between 1982 and 1989, Ross bought and resold several metric tons of cocaine. In 1980 dollars, his gross earnings were said to be in excess of $900 million, with a profit of nearly $300 million. And his distribution empire grew to include 42 cities. The price he paid per kilo of powder cocaine dropped from as much as $60,000 to as low as $10,000. Much of Ross's success at evading law enforcement was due to his ring's possession of police scanners and voice scramblers. Furthermore, journalist Gary Webb alleged that the CIA was sponsoring the operation as part of its efforts to finance the Contras. Following one drug bust, a Los Angeles County sheriff remarked that Ross's men had better equipment than they had. In an interview that Freeway Ricky Ross did with Black Tree TV, which you can find on YouTube, the person asking him the question said, quote, "When stuff hit the fan, did you make the connection that he was affiliated with the governments and their activities?" Unquote. Ross says, quote, "I wish I could say that, but I didn't. Gary Webb did. He came to me and we started talking, and he was one of the ones that really discovered that Blandone's testimony Blandone testified in court that the Reagan administration had given him $18 million, but it wasn't enough to fight a war, so they took it and invested it into drugs, unquote. Now, it is important to note here that Rick Ross knew nothing about the CIA involvement. He knew nothing about the Contra affair, and he knew nothing about his main drug supplier, Blandone, being a Contra member. You have to remember that Rick Ross, and I'm not saying this to disrespect the man, it's just a fact, was illiterate. He couldn't read. So it stands to reason, although he probably had a pretty smart mind for business, because he couldn't have conducted this operation without at least a little bit of business sense, he most definitely, to grow a drug empire the way he did and to get away with it for as long, he definitely had some help, probably by the Central Intelligence Agency. But he was a pawn, and the CIA loves to make people pawns. Rick Ross was intended to be the fall guy in case they got caught, which eventually they knew that they would. Then they could say, well, Rick Ross was the mastermind. He was the drug kingpin. So he was always meant to be a scapegoat for these drug running operations. So now we have to talk about Blandone, which was Rick Ross's supplier, his main drug supplier. Now, Blandone is a Nicaraguan-born drug trafficker who is best known as one of the main subjects of the 1996 newspaper series Dark Alliance by reporter Gary Webb. Blandone was originally a director of architectural markets in Nicaragua until the government was overthrown by a communist force in 1979. Blandone then fled into the United States and then raised money for the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, also known as the FDN, which was a Contra group. As part of his fundraising activities, Blandone began selling cocaine. Eventually, Blandone became a major cocaine trafficker in the Los Angeles area. It is also important to note that the money that he originally had to invest in cocaine in the first place came from the Reagan administration, because Blandone felt that $18 million was not enough to conduct a war, so he then invested it into drugs, with the protection and the blessing of the CIA. In May 1992, Blandone was arrested in San Diego on the federal charge of conspiracy to possess cocaine with intent to distribute. In prison, awaiting trial, Blandone began cooperating with the Drug Enforcement Administration, also known as the DEA, in a number of drug cases. In a plea agreement, now listen to this very carefully here. Remember how we were talking about Rick Ross being the fall guy? Well, here's where that comes into play. In a plea agreement, Blandone agreed to continue cooperating with the government in exchange for a substantial sentence reduction. Eventually, Blandone was sentenced to 48 months. In order to facilitate Blandone's work as an informant, the government further requested a reduction in Blandone's sentence to time served. Following his imprisonment, Blandone worked for the DEA as a confidential informant. He worked for the DEA to take down, now listen to this part really carefully, drug kingpin Rick Ross in a string operation for which Ross was convicted in 1997. Now, how in the world, folks? Imagine that for a minute. Rick Ross was getting his drugs from Blandone. Blandón, who had clear ties to the Contras in Nicaragua and made sure Rick Ross could get Nicaraguan cocaine cheaply. But yet, Rick Ross was the drug kingpin that went down, even though he was getting his drugs from Blandón. As I said before, Rick Ross was always intended to be the fall guy. On a series called American Rats, season 1, episode 5, and it was all about Oscar Blandón, Rick Ross said, quote, "I didn't even know what a Contra was. I didn't know where Nicaragua was. All I cared about was getting my drugs on time," unquote. Keep in mind, once again, Rick Ross was illiterate. He could not read. And he was definitely always intended to be the fall guy. Because it's hilarious, and not hilarious in a good way, hilarious in a horrible way, that Blandón was the one supplying the drugs that were flooding the country. But yet Rick Ross was called the kingpin. So that pretty much wraps up Gary Webb's investigation. There's a lot more to go into detail, but I would never be able to get it all into one video. I do suggest that you read Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series, and you'll learn a whole lot more about the connection between the CIA and drug running. Now I'd like to touch on a subject here that goes way back to Vietnam, the Vietnam conflict. So, during the Korean War, the first allegations of CIA drug trafficking surfaced after 1949, stemming from a deal whereby arms were supplied to, excuse me if I get some of these names wrong, these are Asian names, supplied to Chiang Kai-shek's defeated generals in exchange for intelligence. Later, in the same region, while the CIA was sponsoring a secret war in Laos from 1961 to 1975, it was openly accused of trafficking heroin into the Golden Triangle area to fight its secret war against Pat Lao Communist Movement of Laos. The CIA used the Mao people, or the Hmong population. Because of the war, Hmong depended upon opium poppy cultivation for hard currency. The plan of jars had been captured by Lao fighters in 1964, which resulted in Royal Lao Air Force being unable to land its C-47 transport aircraft on the plain of jars for opium transport. The Royal Latvian Air Force had almost no light planes that could land on the dirt runways near the mountaintop of the poppy fields. Having no way to transport their opium, the Hmong were faced with economic ruin. Air America, a CIA front organization, was the only airline available in northern Laos. Alfred McCoy writes, quote, "According to several unproven sources, Air America began flying opium from mountain villages north and east of the Plain of Jars to CIA asset Hmong General Vang Pao's headquarters at Long Tang," unquote. The CIA's front company, Air America, was alleged to have profited from transporting opium and heroin on behalf of Hmong leader Vang Pao, or of turning a blind eye to the Laos military doing it. This allegation has been supported also by former Laos CIA parliamentary Anthony Posfoni, aka Tony Poe, former Air America pilots, and other people involved in the war. It was portrayed in the movie Air America. During the Vietnam War, U.S. operations in Laos were largely a CIA responsibility. The CIA's surrogate there was a General Vang Pao, who commanded Military Region 2 in northern Laos. He enlisted 30,000 Hmong tribesmen in the service of the CIA. These tribesmen continued to grow, as they had for generations, the opium poppy. Before long, someone there were unproven allegations that it was a mafia family from Florida that had established a heroin drug refinery lab in Region 2. The lab's production was soon being ferried out onto the planes of the CIA's front airline, Air America. A pair of BNDD, which means it was the predecessor of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, agents tried to seize an Air American. Further documentation of the CIA connected and Laos opium trade was provided by Rolling Stone magazine in 1968 and by Alfred McCoy in 1972. McCoy stated that, quote, in most cases, the CIA's roles involved various forms of complicity, tolerance, or studied ignorance about the trade. Not any direct capability in actual trafficking, the CIA did not handle the heroin, but it did provide its drug lord allies with transport, arms, and political protection. In sum, the CIA's role in the Southeast Asian heroin trade involved indirect complicity rather than direct complicity, unquote. However, aviation historian William M. Leary writes that Air America was not involved in the drug trade. Citing that, Joseph Westmere, a physician and public health worker who was a resident in Laos from 1965 to 1975, that, quote, American-owned airlines never knowingly transported opium in or out of Laos, nor did their American pilots ever profit from its transport, unquote. That's kind of funny, considering you have multiple people stating that Air America did indeed transport drugs, and they were a CIA front company. So that takes us all the way back to Vietnam, so that we can see that the CIA were running drugs and were somehow allowed to run a secret little war of their own in the country of Laos, which is a country that is right beside Vietnam. A lot of things wrong with that there. Now, don't get me wrong, I hate communism. I hate socialism. Everybody that knows me knows that. But two wrongs don't make a right. You can't sell drugs and get innocent people hooked on narcotics to then say, well, we're doing it for a just cause. We're fighting against communism. Because then you've just become as bad as the communists that you're attempting to fight against. Communism is wrong. Socialism is wrong. But running massive drug operations to fight them is also wrong. And finally, to wrap this up, we are going to read an article that was written in 2015 about the CIA, or it was rumors that the CIA helps export opium from Afghanistan. This was originally published at Mint Press News. Despite billions being spent to eradicate opium crops in Afghanistan, the crop is more popular than ever there, lending many to wonder whether some U.S. forces may actually be encouraging its growth and the heroin it later becomes. In July, the Centers for Disease Control warned of record-breaking numbers of heroin deaths in the United States. Quote, heroin use more than double among young adults ages 18 to 25 in the past decade, unquote. the CDC reported. In the same month, it was reported that opium production is stronger than ever in Afghanistan, which now produces 90% of the world's supply of the plant that's refined to create heroin. The rise in production would have been impossible prior to the U.S.-led invasion. Wonder what that war was really about. And it comes despite some $8.4 billion spent in counter-narcotics efforts by the U.S., specifically designated to wipe out opium production in Afghanistan. In fact, as Global Post reported in October, under the watchful eye of the U.S., opium use expanded to new parts of Afghanistan, and growers now make use of modern advanced horticultural technologies. Imagine that. With photos circulating in 2010 that show U.S. soldiers patrolling opium fields, which, if you're a YouTube viewer, is the picture that you should be seeing right now. Those are United States soldiers, and they are protecting an opium field. Questions remain about the Americans' real involvement. Questions remain about what America's real involvement may be in the opium trade. As Abby Martin noted in a 2014 investigation from Media Roots, while the Taliban had all but eradicated opium, it began to thrive just months after American forces replaced the Taliban-led government in 2001. How about that? How about that? Isn't that one hell of a coincidence? Martin noted that the CIA has long been tied to the global drug trade, where it's accused of putting more effort into controlling rather than eradicating the illegal substances, she added. Circumstantial evidence aside, there is no conclusive proof that the CIA is physically running opium out of Afghanistan. However, it's hard to believe that a region under full U.S. military occupation, with guard posts and surveillance drones monitoring the mountains of Tora Bora, aren't able to track supply routes of opium exported from the country's various poppy farms. According to a January report from Mother Jones, the DEA agent formerly in charge of the agency's efforts in Afghanistan, reported repeated conflicts between DEA eradication efforts and the CIA agents. Edward Foley's says the DEA and the CIA often bump heads in Afghanistan, while hinting that the CIA sometimes turned a blind eye to the Afghan drug trade. Foley's won't go into specifics. In his book, The Dark Art, My Undercover Life and Global Narcotic Terrorism, he writes, quote, "Almost everywhere in the world I worked, I had static with the CIA. We're often working in the same terrain, but with different legal and moral parameters. They exist completely in the shadows," unquote. Among the groups profiting off the Afghan opium trade and the failed efforts to eradicate it is the mercenary group Academia, better known by its former name, Blackwater. In April, RT reported that Academia earned $569 billion from counter-narcotics contracts in Afghanistan. The notorious company has been the biggest beneficiary of counter-narcotics expenditure in the war-torn country. Well, folks, that is the end of my report and my research. Everything that I have told you tonight can be proven. You can all look it up. It's all a matter of public domain. It's all in the public domain, and you can all research it and get the same exact information that I got tonight. And the picture here of the American troops patrolling the opium fields and protecting the opium fields is all over the internet. I think that we have enough evidence to conclude that the CIA definitely supports and indulges in drug trafficking around the world in order to support their own secret wars. I believe the CIA is a dangerous and subversive organization. I believe they have become a terrorist organization. I believe that one of their main goals, even though I cannot prove this, is to traffic and flood the United States with drugs in order to help destroy our republic so that a one world government can be created. That's really the name of the game for these people, folks. All the secret societies that are bringing these things together use people like the CIA every day to do their dirty deeds. Now, I'm not saying everybody in the CIA is a bad person, but clearly there are some very bad people in the CIA, and I would definitely call them traitors. They have definitely committed treason, and they should be shut down and done away with forever. Long live liberty, long live the Republic, death to the New World Order, and let's end the CIA once and for all. Let's destroy the CIA in this country.